podcast excellence since 2005. This is the King of Podcasts radio network, kingofpodcasts.com.
Before the FCC has their public comment on deregulation, can we talk a little bit about ownership?
The King of Podcasts radio network proudly presents the Broadcasters Podcast. Here is the King of Podcasts.
And welcome to episode 374 of the Broadcasters Podcast. I'm here, King of Podcasts, in the newly renovated Man Cave Studios here, South Florida, USA. I haven't said that in a long time, but I'm saying newly renovated because I actually did take some of this jungle gym type of microphone cranes that I've had around in my studio here for a while that I was using and I wasn't necessarily happy about. I switched it out. Like I just took what I had and just threw it away. I had one of those Vivor microphone arms that I saw in the TikTok shop. It looked good, but you can't do anything with it. You can't move that around much. So I changed it and I found something much more reasonable on Amazon. I bought it and I got it here same day. It's great. It's right in front of me. Real convenient. So I prefer this now to the duration. So FCC Deregulation. Let's go into the story itself and just make sure everybody knows what we're talking about. The chairman at the FCC, Brendan Carr, is opening a new docket titled, In Response to Delete. He is seeking comment on, quote, every rule, regulation, or guidance document that the FCC should eliminate for the purposes of alleviating unnecessary regulatory burdens. And among the criteria that Carr is seeking comments on is a cost-benefit considerations, experience gained from the implementation of the rule, marketplace and technological changes, regulation as barrier to entry, changes in the broader regulatory context, changes in or other implications of the governing legal framework, and other considerations relevant to the retrospective review of commission rules. That's part of a full public notice he put out. Now, as this happens, the idea of deregulating everything, it's something that I am a bit concerned about because it brings up a lot of things to me what this wants, what it does. And there's a lot of there's a lot of conversations about this where it's being done. So here are the 5 outline key areas we're talking about. The FCC is examining whether certain regulations impose more costs and benefits on businesses and whether eliminating or modifying these rules could lead to better economic outcomes. Right. So a little bit of economic relief for various companies, media companies within the FCC. With rapid advancements in digital communications, broadband, and broadcasting, they want to identify rules that have become outdated or unnecessary. All right, there's probably a couple of those. The studio rule, the local studio rule, that's probably going to get eliminated from something like this. That might be one of the things that will come in. And then really just a matter of what will be limitations to what the signals might be out there for radio stations or for television and what they're able to go and do, I guess. I'm not sure. They want to also analyze whether regulations place a disproportionate burden on smaller firms, limiting competition and innovation. And they want to consider whether some regulations conflict with recent judicial rulings, which includes the Supreme Court's Bright decision overturning the Chevron deference framework that previously granted agencies significantly weight in interpreting statutes. And also reviewing whether existing FCC rules overlap with broader federal, state, or industry self-regulatory measures, potentially creating unnecessary compliance burdens. And of course, the National Association of Broadcasters, they love this. So they also have started a mass public awareness campaign tied to loosening ownership caps on radio and television broadcasters. Yes, the continuation just to go and go forward on just eliminating anybody else to control any kind of media of the legacy, of the traditional linear media that's out there, the establishment. They don't want anybody else to do it. So a couple weeks ago, yes, the NAB, they have now a multi-platform campaign urging the FCC to modernize long-standing local radio ownership regulations. And that's the idea of, this deregulation public hearing, they're obviously going to go ahead and approach the FCC saying that they want to bring in decades-old rules in line with today's competitive media landscape, where broadcasters must compete against big tech platforms that operate unrestricted. The FCC's current ownership regulations limit the number of radio and TV stations a broadcaster can own in a single market Television stations, for television, ownership is at 39% of U.S. households. Radio ownership is still restricted per market. I think it's 8 stations still, but that's a lot. So they want to get this here so they can go ahead and go up against big tech. They do not need to be going up against big tech. They're not going to win. Especially radio. They do not need to be doing this. And television, the same thing. Doesn't even matter. Because by making these changes here, no matter what, radio can stream all their content up against everybody else. Television can do the same thing. A lot of places are going to do that. Now, there was a delegation of the NAB that did meet with Brendan Carr and Acting Media Bureau Chief Aaron Boone on February 21st to discuss this very point. And the push for regulatory reforms would enable broadcasters to compete more effectively in an increasingly digital media environment. That's the part we don't need to worry about. For the National Association of Broadcasters and these established linear radio TV stations, they do not need to be competing with digital, because my argument has always been they can stand alone. So I want to read a story that I went ahead and put together with the help of AI, because I wanted to go and put the argument out there. The future of media ownership, because this is the thing that has been the biggest problem more than anything else. I'm not care about, okay, you want to take out regulations that are outdated or do not need to be out there that also cost stations more money. Okay, fine. We can discuss that. But see, the NAB and Curtis Legate, they want to go ahead and go underneath the radar and try to get the ownership caps dropped. Because what they want is complete deregulation, which means they want ownership caps to be nothing. That every big major corporate entity can go ahead and buy up any station they want. All of them. And it'll be worse than 1996. You understand? It will be worse than 1996. If you need to go back for reference, just go back to the episode I did a couple of years ago where we commemorated the 25th anniversary of this particular moment, the Telecommunications Act of 1986. We can go ahead and go through that when it actually was signed. But I'm telling you, it was not fun. I did not enjoy this. And I saw the changes because when I was in college, the changes were going on around us. Before I graduated high school, we didn't have this full-fledged issue of radio stations that could be bought by everybody. There was a 4-station cap, 2 AM and 2 FM stations in each market. That was consuming of all, which we could go back to that again. I don't even see why we couldn't. It's not a matter of these stations cannot have a number of owners. That's the part I want to make clear of. That I like to have a diversity of stations based on ownership, not based on big corporations controlling the formats. I don't want that anymore. Because to be honest with you, okay. So if I have stations that are operating, let's say Spanish content, okay, if it's tropical, if it's reggaeton, if it's regional Mexican, whatever you want. I'm pretty sure that the stations that are operating with a real Spanish contingency are not big corporations. Yes, you have Televisa Univision, and they have their way of operating their stations. Same thing goes for SBS. These are the 2 main controllers of all the major radio stations, Spanish language broadcasting around the country. Hundreds of stations in this. And really don't serve the public much. You want to talk about radio stations that are behind the times, that are outdated, that are out of touch, out of tune with what's going on with the market of music. Meanwhile, the Latin American music market, they're all listening on Spotify, Apple, and everywhere else. Or YouTube. They're not listening to the radio. Radio is so far behind. And only have certain stars you want to go ahead and placate to anyway. How about stations for the urban contemporary market? Or might say the black stations, right? But it would be black, Hispanic. Your R&B, hip hop, old school radio stations. there's a difference when you see certain stations that are being operated by iHeartRadio and how they operate. Unless they're a heritage station that is able to hold on to themselves, more or less, there's a difference when you hear what Power 105.1 in New York sounds like versus what you might hear over at, let's say, KMEL in San Francisco. Because that station still kind of holds on to itself and the identity that it has. Or Detroit trying to hold on to its identity, the station up there. Or, a number of other stations. But if we have a smaller company like an Urban One that operates stations, they say out of Atlanta or out of New York or wherever else, and it's a different feel to the market. Even Cox with some of their stations, down here with, the stations I have down here in Miami, which becomes the 99 Jams or Hot 105, still have somewhat of an attachment to the local community and to the music that people listen to in general because they're heritage stations, both of them, in their own separate ways. But then I also listen to other stations when they're owned by local operators and how much difference it can go into. Now, the best of both worlds would be if we had deregulation where some of the rules, regulations, and extra fees or costs that were able to be removed for smaller operators so they can operate better and then they can reinvest some of the money they would have to pay towards maybe new talent, maybe something they're going to do more with the stations themselves. I like that idea. I like that idea to kind of foster some more opportunities for radio to go and burgeon and grow, because we need radio not to be operated by these big behemoth companies because they're not doing anything with them. They're placeholders. They're homogenizing their formats. They're using syndicated radio content as they've been doing for years. There is nothing under commercial loads that are anyway interesting or anything that's being paid for because they have nothing to go and sell. They have no ads to sell. They have no ads to put into the system. Meanwhile, all these other local stations I listen to, yeah, they got ads. Isn't that amazing? Maybe a little tired of hearing the same national ads over and over or the same promos over and over for all these stations for iHeart or for Cumulus or whatever else because they have no inventory. Maybe they're in the middle of the day. Maybe morning drive, maybe afternoon drive. That's about it. But everything else is just dead. No life, no local kind of feel to any of these stations that are out there owned by big corporate outlets. Let's get them to somebody else. Let's force a couple of things to happen. Let's get the American Music Fairness Act out there. Make the royalties be fairly paid by these radio stations. They won't last. These big corporate stations with a supposed $10 million cap on how much they make in revenue, they're not going to be able to last on that. The amount of money they're going to have to go and fork out for royalties, they won't be able to last. And of course, the NAB, they want the opposing act, the Local Radio Freedom Act, which keeps it as a cap like it has been with the Copyright Royalty Board. Of course they do. Of course they do. So now the FCC is going to have their upcoming hearing on media ownership rules. And now the future of local news, media diversity is more important than ever. Consolidating media outlets over the past few decades has reshaped the industry, raising concerns about the accessibility of independent voices. Local news and competition. I don't need to go and get into the whole point of where the attention to detail, the performance of radio stations when they had local news, when they had local content, when you had contests, when you had things that were drawing the audience in, when you had new music you were breaking right then and there. There's still a thing where radio can still be a tastemaker. I mean, satellite radio kind of proves that right now. But what does radio do now? We're not doing any of that. So out of touch, which is why we see the Billboard Hot 100 so stagnant over the last couple of years. But the good news I kept hearing in the background is that there's going to be an algorithm change, which I hope means that Billboard's finally going to go ahead and start tweaking the algorithm and declining the measurement power of radio airplay. Oh, yeah, that real fake generated crap they've been doing for years. Yeah, that's a great idea. How about work on real organic numbers, not this staged crap by these corporate radio companies? The inflated radio airplay of songs that do not need to be played so much. That are of songs that are maybe, 8 months to a year to older than that? Do you really think that when we look at the top 10 of the Billboard Hot 100, do you really feel like everybody's still clamoring for Benson Boone's Beautiful Things or Teddy Swims' Lose Control or Shabuzi's A Bar Song? Really? I don't see it. But there's all that going on. Radio airplay has way too much value on that chart. Take some of it away, weigh streaming more, and see the difference. Because once that algorithm change comes up, if that's the case, sales and streaming become much more prioritized than radio airplay. That's a good thing. And radio needs to be careful because that can happen. Now, does further deregulation serve the public interest, or does it limit the diversity of perspectives in the media landscape? And I say it like this. It doesn't mean perspectives in the media landscape where you need to have voices on some of these stations that might be operated by somebody else. No. I want ownership. I want diversity of ownership. So when we have a station that is in the community that is Hispanic owned, I want a Hispanic owning it. If it's black related or urban related, I want a black owner, right? If it was somebody programming Haitian music, I want it to be a Haitian owner. Like, why can't we do that? Is there something wrong with that? And also, maybe the stats will also be pertinent to what they're programming. I want a bazaar. I want a market of like different stations, different feels, different flavors, all across the board. Because I had that before. We had that. And what happened? The 90s, I'll tell you, like, I remember going on trips to Orlando, right? Disney, Universal, whatever. Or just being in Miami and listening to the stations down here and the variety of music we had. Y100 was hot. Power 96 was hot. We just had, the Coast, 97.3. And Magical 102.7 with the oldies. Like, we just had different stations, different varieties, different flavors of everything. 99 Jams, also good stuff. All across the board, we had different music going on, and we had a flavor. But something happened. It just all changed. Might have been some micromanaging of all these different stations. And also remember, in the 80s, even more, when you had top 40 radio or just rock stations, it would just be a plethora. We had WSHE for rock, album-oriented rock. We had 94.9 Zeta for alternative rock. And, of course, West Palm, its own little segment as well. Different. We'd have experimental stations out there. Remember when we had rhythmic oldies? Right? Jamming oldies? Those kind of things that happened. Like, that was really fun. What happened to all that? Well, again, in the mid-90s, it all happened. Mergers and acquisitions resulting in fewer companies owning more media properties, particularly in TV, radio, and newspapers. And consolidation might create efficiencies, but it's reducing the number of independent newsrooms, limiting the range of content available to consumers. But that's local news. That's another thing. But look at how much talent is not working anywhere. They had to go somewhere else because there's just nothing left. A diverse media ownership structure fosters competition and innovation. Audiences will have access to a wide range of viewpoints and reporting styles. Independent outlets, locally owned stations, more tuned to the needs of communities, providing coverage that larger national entities might overlook. And ownership diversity is not about restricting growth, but about maintaining balance. You have incentives for new entrants, protections against excessive consolidation. A variety of perspectives and business models can thrive. Imagine if the community had their own pipelines for everything. And they had a place where they can go to and get their voices heard. And by the way, all these stations could be operating with a streaming platform, with social media presence. All of them right now. Imagine if they could do that. If you had a diversity where they're holding concerts, they're holding events, they get the artists that go and come in, do an interview, whatever that is, like all those kind of things. Makes a big deal. You actually create some life back to these stations. Imagine that. Industry evolution is inevitable for media. Of course it is. Maintaining a marketplace that includes a large and small mix of players benefits consumers and strengthens local journalism. And I'm not saying corporate does not need to be around. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that some of these radio companies, they need to go and divest some of their stations to pay off their debt. And also for the public good, the public interest of the public airways, because the people own the airways. It would be nice to go back to the point, okay, iHeart, you got what, 8 stations in this market? You got to go down to 3 and 3. Or, you know what, 4 FMs, 2 AMs. Cut down. Those other stations you can't hold on to, you sell them. You let them go. Someone else can go and take over those signals, and they can operate them. Imagine if they did that. You force these radio stations to go and unload. Same thing for TV stations. If they have too many owners in one market of too many stations, yeah, unload them. That would be a great mix of things too. It really would. I don't know if it will happen, but I'd love to go and see something like this come across. So an open comment period on deregulating everything. Once we get to that, we'll keep up on it. Now, another thing we got to talk about here is where there are differences that where the FCC review could really impact radio. Because one of the things we're worrying about is that the FCC is also, weighing against content among radio and TV stations. So right now, the NAB, CBS Network, the Radio TV Digital News Association, and other press organizations, they're urging the FCC to end the investigation on whether a New York TV station should have its license potentially revoked for a segment on 60 Minutes that drew the fire of President Trump, the editing of the then Vice President and then presidential candidate Kamala Harris, when she was interviewed by Bill Whitaker on 60 Minutes. The NAB says the review has significant implications for radio and TV stations across the country, where they have a news talk format or air news with public officials and candidates. The trade group says the complaint against WCBS TV fails to make the case for a violation of FCC news distortion policy, but the raw footage and transcripts released by the network fails to provide any evidence. But the editing in question was designed to deliberately mislead viewers, and the news distortion policy is unconstitutionally vague, closely aligned with the now ended fairness doctrine. So I'm pretty sure that the regulations for content are going to be asked for by these entities right now through the same kind of period right now on deregulation. If they can get not an increase in enforcement on content, they're worried about that more than anything now. But we need something to happen with these radio stations because they continue to go and go nowhere. If you look at the constant things right now, no matter would you just listen to the first, second quarter, whatever earnings results for all these stations and how they're performing so far? Badly. But nothing's being done about it. They're allowed to go and continue to go and just sputter around, continue to expand and extend their interest going into the next decade because they can. Bankruptcy rules are still put in place where until we see what the FCC is going to do right now with Odyssey and the foreign ownership caps on Soros Fund Management and see if they're actually going to do anything about it. These are the things we got to figure out when it comes to this public comment as well. Ownership is going to be a part of this. It should be in the conversation. It has to be. I understand and I can totally comprehend the idea of going after regulations that are outdated. That's fine. Go after that. But please, if there's anything that needs to be regulated right now in this industry, radio and television of the legacy establishment, corporate radio and television needs to be regulated. They cannot continue to go and hold on to what they have right now, not serve the public interest, water down and devalue these stations day by day. Meanwhile, they can't do anything. Right now, Cumulus is going to the latest issue. What was it? They were going after something right now where they were going to get delisted right now from the stock exchange once again. Well, how about this? They're now shutting off struggling stations. So there have been some changes going on so far that they had last November in San Francisco. they made one of their conservative talk stations move from their 5,000 watt perch to a 50,000 watt stick at 8:10 a.m., and KGO, the long-term news talk station, dropped. And they switched the stations over, where now 810 KGO has become a sports betting based station, and it's just bad. Did the same thing over here in West Palm Beach, where WBCT was the more prominent station, and WJNO had a lower signal, and they switched because WJNO had the more prominent format or more prominent lineup of hosts. That's what they decided to do. But now this 810 format has been assigned the calls KZAC with a format to be announced March 3rd, 8:10 a.m. is no longer operating. Cumulus elected to pull the plug and take care of KZAC dark while it decides what to do with the station. And in Lexington, Kentucky, Cumulus made a decision to shut down ratings challenge adult hits WLXX 101.5 Jack FM rather than explore an alternative format. So Cumulus spoke with Radio and Music Pros, or RAMP 24/7, and said, as part of our ongoing efforts to optimize our portfolio and allocate resources effectively in our local markets, we have determined that stations are no longer the right strategic fit within their respective markets. So we made a decision to suspend operations of these stations, an adjustment that impacts very few individuals, but we evaluate the best path forward, allowing us to focus on strengthening and maximizing the impact of our other brands. What? Well, then why are these stations allowed to go ahead and make these stations dormant? Go dark. If you have nothing to do for them, sell them off to somebody else that can use them. Cumulus, big radio company. They can't figure out ways to go ahead and get ratings onto any particular formats or whatever they're doing. So they make changes here. Bad changes. And now they're still allowed to go and let these stations just go dormant when somebody could be using them and operating them. They don't want to do that either. It's stupid. But they're allowed to go and get away with it. It's a shame. And no one's doing anything about it. Just saying about that like that. And now there's a story from Variety that came out this week as well. I want to wrap things up with this, but Spotify paid over $4.5 billion to music publishers over the last 2 years. We had that announcement we had a couple weeks ago. Talked about that. Well, Variety asks, why are songwriters struggling? See, if radio is actually paying their own fair share, we might not have this much of a problem. But anyway, the story comes on and says that Spotify released their music economics report titled Loud and Clear. The company notes in 2024, nearly 1,500 artists generated over $1 million of royalties from Spotify alone. Independent artists and labels collectively generated more than $5 billion from the service. The number of artists generating royalties at every threshold on the site, from 1,000 to 10 million per year, has at least tripled since 2017. Now, Spotify will pay rights holders for the music, a label and music publisher, which then distributes the money to artists and songwriters after taking their percentage and distributing other percentages to other interested parties, such as producers, music distributors, etc. So the artists are not pocketing all that money. They're getting a cut. A London-based marketing intelligence consulting firm, Media Research, said that the approximate 0.004 cents generated per stream is divided thus: the recording side, with the label, distributor, and artist getting 56% of the cut, the streaming service getting 30%, and the publishing side, which is the publisher, performing rights organization like his ASCAP or BMI, and the songwriter, 14% of that. And at 14%, the songwriter gets 68%, the publisher 17%, the pro, performance rights organization, 15%. But they don't take into account the fact that most hit songs have between 3 and 12 writers splitting up 68% of that product, and they have managers and possibly other interested parties earning a percentage of their share. The human brain can't even comprehend the infinitesimal amount of the creators of most songs earned per stream. Now, we're talking about the Copyright Royalty Board, which has been paying a bigger rate to songwriters and music publishers by 23%. But Spotify recently came under fire under fierce criticism from the music community, not to mention for their music audiobooks bundle, which Billboard estimated would decrease the amount of royalties paid to music companies by $150 million over the next year. But that's the part that I talk about right here as well. imagine if we had something happen where the American Music Fairness Act, that bill were to get passed. Royalties tacked on to radio stations, the big corporate ones. I'm sure if you had some ownership diversity because the caps on ownership of stations were changed, I'm sure there wouldn't be much of an issue for some of these other radio outlets to go ahead and pay the royalties because it'll be based on the size of the stations. Because I'm pretty sure one thing I would venture to guess, if you have local ownership, I would not be surprised if they know how to make money on their stations. Because you do. That's the way it is. They figure out how to do it. And that's a good thing. But maybe we got to go and learn that lesson a little bit more. I don't know. So I implore for those that are going to go ahead and make the comments now towards the SEC, this public hearing, this public comment period, I will give a vocal comment right now. Let's change the ownership caps. It's time for something like that to happen. Talk about something that's outdated and has not been useful and has not helped the industry at all. And all these radio stations have suffered as a result. Ownership caps. Maybe don't get it down to 2 AMs and 2 FMs, but let's get it down to 4 FMs and 2 AMs. That'll be a great move. I hope somebody out there will overlook with the NAB, the RTNDA, and all these other outlets that want to deregulate everything because their big corporate backers are having to go and lobby for it. Come back for another Broadcasters Podcast. Remember, the content is king and the control of your content is in your hands.